The photograph arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by my neighbor Mrs. Henderson with the kind of apologetic smile that precedes devastation. She'd found it mixed in with her mail. A mistake by the postal service, she said, though we both knew the real mistake was mine. Believing I still mattered enough to be invited to my own family's Easter celebration, I held the glossy print between trembling fingers, studying faces I'd known since birth. There was my daughter, Sarah, radiant in her cream-colored dress, her arm draped around her teenage son, Marcus. My son, David, stood behind them, his hand resting protectively on his wife, Jennifer's shoulder. Even my ex-husband, Robert, was there, looking distinguished in his navy blazer, playing the role of beloved patriarch he'd never quite mastered when we were married. The table was set with my grandmother's china, the delicate blue and white pattern I'd carefully preserved through 2 moves and countless dinner parties. 12 place settings arranged with military precision around the mahogany table that had once anchored our family dining room, now gracing Sarah's suburban palace. They'd even used my crystal wine glasses, the ones Robert and I had received as a wedding gift 43 years ago. But I wasn't there. I wasn't anywhere in the frame, not even a shadow, or the suggestion of someone who'd stepped away momentarily. The composition was perfect, complete, as if I'd never existed at all. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Mrs. Henderson said, lingering in my doorway. "I thought you should see it, but maybe—" "No," I forced my voice steady. "Thank you for bringing it over." She hesitated, her weathered hands clutching her cardigan. "Didn't they invite you?" The question hung between us like smoke. Clara Henderson had lived next door for 15 years, had watched my children grow up, had seen me transform from a harried mother of 2 into an empty nester, and finally into this, a woman whose own family found her so expendable they could celebrate Easter without her and document it for posterity. Of course they did, I lied, the words tasting like ash. I was feeling under the weather, but even as I spoke, my mind was racing backward through the weeks leading up to Easter, searching for the invitation that had never come. Sarah's last call had been brief, distracted, something about being busy with work and the kids' schedules. David hadn't called at all, though Jennifer had sent a perfunctory text asking about my arthritis. Robert and I only spoke through lawyers now, and even that had dwindled to nothing since the divorce was finalized 18 months ago. I closed the door and leaned against it, studying the photograph again. In the background, I could see my mother's silver serving pieces arranged on the sideboard, the ones I'd inherited when she passed 3 years ago. Sarah had asked to borrow them, just for this Easter, and I'd agreed, thinking I'd be there to see them used. The irony wasn't lost on me. Even my mother's memory had been conscripted into their revisionist family history. The worst part wasn't the exclusion itself. It was how effortless they made it look, how naturally they'd closed ranks around my absence. Marcus was laughing at something David had said. Jennifer was serving herself from what looked like my recipe for glazed ham. Sarah was holding court at the head of the table. My seat, the one where I'd presided over countless family dinners, birthday celebrations, and holiday gatherings. They looked relieved. That realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an oversight or a cruel joke. This was an experiment, and apparently, it had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The family functioned perfectly well without me. Better, even. I walked to my kitchen and poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, something I'd started doing more frequently since the divorce. The amber liquid burned pleasantly, warming the cold hollow that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. Through the window, I could see the cherry tree Robert had planted for our 10th anniversary, now heavy with pink blossoms that would drop their petals like confetti, for a celebration I was no longer invited to attend. The phone rang. For a moment, my heart lurched. Perhaps Sarah calling to explain, to apologize, to reveal this had all been a terrible misunderstanding. But the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, probably another telemarketer trying to sell me life insurance or cemetery plots. I let it ring. Instead, I found myself opening my laptop and navigating to Sarah's Facebook page. She'd posted the same photograph, along with several others from their gathering. The comments were a chorus of hearts and beautiful family sentiments from friends who'd once included me in their warm wishes. Aunt Linda from Phoenix had written, "Missing you, Margaret," followed by a sad face emoji, which Sarah had liked but not responded to. Even Robert's sister had commented, "Wonderful to see everyone together," as if my absence were as natural as the changing seasons. I scrolled through the other photos. There was Marcus blowing out candles on an elaborate carrot cake. Had Sarah remembered that was his favorite because I'd mentioned it? Or was this new intelligence she'd gathered independently? David and Jennifer's twin girls, now 7, were engaged in what appeared to be an Easter egg hunt in Sarah's backyard. Robert was pushing the youngest on the swing set, playing grandfather with an enthusiasm he'd never shown as a father. They'd built a complete parallel universe in which I simply didn't exist. The bourbon made me bold enough to reach for my phone. Sarah answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear the chaos of cleanup in the background, running water, the clink of dishes, children's laughter echoing from another room. "Mom. Hi. How are you feeling?" The practiced concern in her voice made my stomach clench. "Feeling? David said you weren't feeling well yesterday. That's why you couldn't make it to dinner." Yesterday, Easter Sunday, the day I'd spent in my bathrobe, working through a crossword puzzle and half watching a marathon of old movies on cable. The day I'd wondered why nobody had called, why my phone had remained stubbornly silent except for 2 robocalls and a text from my dentist confirming next week's appointment. "I'm feeling fine," I said carefully. When exactly did I tell David I wasn't feeling well? There was a pause, just long enough for me to understand the scope of their deception. "Oh, you know how it is, Mom. Things get mixed up in translation." Jennifer thought she heard, or maybe it was Marcus who said, "Sarah." "What?" I was never invited to Easter dinner. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. In the background, I could hear David's voice asking who was on the phone, and Sarah's muffled response. When she came back on the line, her tone had shifted from flustered to defensive. "Mom, that's not... we assumed you'd want to spend it quietly this year. After everything with Dad and the divorce, and you've seemed so tired lately. You assumed. You've been different since the separation. More withdrawn. We thought maybe you needed space." Space. I repeated the word, testing its weight. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Mom, you're being dramatic. It was just one dinner. We can have you over next weekend or with my grandmother's china." "What?" "You used grandmother's china and her silver, the pieces I inherited." Another pause. "You said we could borrow them for a dinner I was supposed to attend." Sarah's sigh was audible even through the phone. "Look, if you're upset about the dishes, I can bring them back tomorrow. I was going to return them anyway. Keep them." "What?" "Keep the china. Keep the silver. Clearly, you're the one hosting family dinners now." I ended the call before she could respond, my hand shaking as I set the phone aside. The silence of my small apartment felt different now. Not peaceful, but accusatory. Every surface seemed to reflect my failure. The stack of unread books on the coffee table, the wilting flowers I'd bought myself last week, the single place setting drying in the dish rack. When had I become so easy to discard? The question haunted me through the evening as I moved through my abbreviated routines. Dinner for one, television programs chosen by committee of one, bedtime determined by nothing more pressing than fatigue. I'd spent 2 years learning to live alone after Robert left, mastering the art of solitude, teaching myself to find contentment in my own company. But solitude was a choice. This was exile. I found myself studying the photograph again before bed, searching for clues I might have missed. But the more I looked, the more obvious it became. They weren't just excluding me from this one dinner. They were practicing, testing how it felt to be a family without me. And judging by their expressions, the experiment had been a resounding success. That night, I dreamed of empty chairs and silent telephones. I dreamed of being erased from family portraits, my face fading like an old Polaroid left in sunlight, until only the outline remained, a ghost-shaped space where a mother used to be. When I woke at 3 a.m., my cheeks were wet with tears I didn't remember shedding. But alongside the grief, something else was stirring. Something harder, more purposeful. If they wanted to know what life looked like without me, I would show them. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to know how long they'd been planning this, how deep the conspiracy went, and what they hoped to gain by cutting me out so completely. I needed to know my enemy, and then, when I had all the pieces, I would teach them the difference between choosing to be alone and being abandoned. I would show them what absence really looked like. The game, I realized with crystalline clarity, was just beginning. The investigation began at dawn, fueled by coffee strong enough to strip paint, and a fury I hadn't felt since Robert announced he was leaving me for his 28-year-old dental hygienist. I started with my phone, scrolling back through months of increasingly brief conversations with my children, looking for the precise moment when their voices had shifted from loving to perfunctory. Sarah's texts told the story in fragments. Can't make dinner Sunday, crazy busy with work. Marcus has a tournament, maybe next time. Rain check on shopping? Jennifer needs help with the twins. Each excuse had seemed reasonable in isolation, but arranged chronologically, they formed a pattern of systematic withdrawal. David's communication was even more sparse. Our last actual conversation had been in January, when he'd called to ask if I needed help with my taxes. Before that, an awkward lunch in December where he'd checked his phone every 5 minutes and claimed an emergency at work to leave early. His wife Jennifer had been warmer, but even her messages had dwindled to holiday pleasantries and the occasional health inquiry. I pulled out a legal pad and began constructing a timeline, marking each canceled plan, each abbreviated phone call, each instance where I'd been made to feel like an imposition. The pattern emerged like a photograph in Developer Solution. The alienation had begun shortly after my divorce was finalized, accelerating through the winter months until by Easter, they'd apparently decided I was expendable altogether. But why now? What had changed? The answer came to me as I was refilling my coffee cup, catching sight of my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked older than my 55 years, worn down by 18 months of legal battles, financial uncertainty, and the grinding loneliness of starting over after a marriage that had lasted half my life. My hair had gone completely gray, and I'd stopped bothering to color it. I'd gained weight during the divorce proceedings, stress eating my way through boxes of crackers and pints of ice cream. My clothes hung differently, my posture had shifted, and somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being the vibrant mother and grandmother they remembered. I'd become an inconvenience, a reminder of failure and sadness that didn't match the Instagram-perfect life Sarah was cultivating or the ambitious young professional image David was projecting at his law firm. The realization stung, but it also clarified things. This wasn't about love or family loyalty. It was about optics. I didn't fit their narrative anymore. I spent the morning diving deeper, social media stalking my own children with the dedication of a private investigator. Sarah's Facebook revealed a careful curation of family moments that conspicuously excluded me. Christmas morning with the grandchildren, but the gifts were from Grandpa Rob, not from me. David's LinkedIn showed him at various professional events, often with Jennifer, presenting the image of a successful power couple, unburdened by messy family drama. Even the grandchildren seemed to be forgetting me. Marcus, now 15, hadn't responded to my last 3 text messages. The twins barely acknowledged my presence during our infrequent video calls, more interested in their tablets than their grandmother's questions about school and friends. I was being systematically edited out of their lives. The phone rang around noon, startling me from my research. Sarah's name appeared on the caller ID, and I let it ring 4 times before answering, not wanting to seem too eager. Mom, we need to talk. Do we? I spoke with David this morning. We're both concerned about your reaction yesterday. You seemed, paranoid. Paranoid. The word hit like a slap. Paranoid about what, exactly? About the dinner invitation. Mom, we've been trying to include you, but you always seem so tired, so overwhelmed. We thought you might prefer. You thought. You decided. You assumed. I kept my voice level, but my free hand was clenched into a fist. Tell me, Sarah, when exactly was this family meeting where you all decided what I needed? There was no meeting, because it sounds like you, David, Jennifer, and even your father had a very thorough discussion about my mental state and social preferences without actually consulting me. Sarah sighed, the sound of someone dealing with a difficult child. Mom, you're reading too much into this. We're worried about you. Ever since the divorce, you've been different. Bitter. It's like you're angry at the whole world. I'm angry at you. The words surprised us both. I hadn't planned to be so direct, but there it was, hanging in the air like gunsmoke. Mom, I'm angry that you used my grandmother's china for a family dinner I wasn't invited to. I'm angry that you've apparently been discussing my mental health with everyone except me. I'm angry that my son hasn't called me in months, and my daughter treats me like a social obligation she's too busy to fulfill. That's not fair, isn't it? Tell me, Sarah, when was the last time you called me just to talk? Not to cancel plans, not to ask me to babysit, not because you needed something. When did you last call because you missed me? The silence stretched long enough for me to have my answer. I miss my kids, I continued, surprised by how calm I sounded. I miss being part of a family instead of being managed by one. I miss being invited instead of being tolerated. We're not managing you. You're 42 years old, and you still need your brother's permission to have dinner with your mother? Nobody needs permission. Then prove it. Come over for coffee this afternoon. Just you. No David, no Jennifer. No family conference call to discuss whether spending an hour with me is worth the risk to your social calendar. Another pause. I could practically hear her mental calculator working, weighing the cost of refusing against the effort of compliance. I can't today. The kids have... Tomorrow then. Mom, this week is crazy with work. Next week? I don't know, maybe. I'll have to check my schedule. I hung up. The afternoon brought a call from David, clearly dispatched by his sister to smooth things over. His approach was different. Less emotional manipulation, more rational problem-solving. He'd inherited Robert's belief that every conflict could be resolved with the right combination of logic and condescension. Mom, Sarah says you're upset about Easter. I'm not upset about Easter. I'm upset about being invisible. You're not invisible. You're family. Then why wasn't I there? Because... He stopped, regrouped. Look, we should have handled this better. We should have called you directly instead of making assumptions. But Mom, you have to understand our position. You've been going through a lot with the divorce, and sometimes when you're in pain, you lash out. We didn't want the kids to see you if you weren't at your best, at my best, as if grief and disappointment were character flaws instead of natural responses to having your life turned upside down. What would my best look like, David? What do you mean? What version of me would be acceptable for family dinners? Should I pretend the last 2 years didn't happen? Should I smile and make small talk about the weather while you all use my inherited china to celebrate how much better everything is without me? Nobody said anything about being better without you. You didn't have to say it. The photograph said it for you. I could hear him typing in the background, probably answering emails while humoring his difficult mother. The sound made me want to reach through the phone and shake him. Mom, you're catastrophizing. It was one dinner. How many family gatherings have I missed this year? I don't know. A few maybe. I don't know either. Because I stopped counting after I realized nobody was bothering to invite me anymore. The typing stopped. That's not... We invite you to things. When? When was the last time you asked me to dinner? To a movie? To meet you for lunch? When did you last include me in a plan that didn't involve babysitting or house sitting or some other service I could provide? He was quiet for a long moment. I've been busy with the new partnership track at work. Everyone's busy, David. But busy is a choice. And apparently I'm not a priority. You're my mother. Yes, I am. And you're my son. Which means you should know better than anyone that I didn't raise you to be the kind of man who abandons family when they need you most. I haven't abandoned anyone. Haven't you? When was the last time you asked how I was doing? Really asked. Not just a polite inquiry you could dismiss with a one-word answer. When did you last want to spend time with me instead of feeling obligated to? The question hung between us, unanswered because we both knew the truth. He couldn't remember either. This isn't productive, Mom. We're both getting worked up over nothing. Over nothing. I laughed, though there was no humor in it. My children have decided I'm no longer worth including in their lives, and you call it nothing. That's not what happened. Then explain to me what did happen. Walk me through the decision-making process that resulted in my entire family celebrating Easter without me. Sarah said you weren't feeling well. Sarah lied. She lied because the truth was too ugly. You all wanted me gone, and she was too cowardly to tell me directly. Mom, stop. You're being paranoid again. There was that word again. Paranoid. The universal dismissal. The way you could invalidate someone's legitimate concerns by questioning their mental state. It was the same tactic Robert had used during our marriage whenever I questioned his long hours or mysterious phone calls, making me doubt my own perceptions instead of addressing my concerns. I'm not paranoid, David. I'm awake. Maybe for the first time in months, I'm seeing clearly. What's that supposed to mean? But I was done explaining myself to children who had already decided I was the problem. Nothing. It means nothing. Just like I apparently do. I ended the call and turned off my phone. The rest of the day passed in a strange calm. I made myself a proper dinner. Salmon with roasted vegetables, a small salad, a glass of decent wine. I set the table with my everyday dishes, lit a candle, and dined like a civilized person, instead of eating standing up at the kitchen counter, like I'd been doing since the divorce. After dinner, I walked to my bedroom closet and pulled out the boxes I'd stored on the top shelf, photo albums and scrapbooks from when the children were young, box after box of memories, birthday parties and school plays, family vacations and quiet Sunday mornings, pictures of David learning to ride a bike, Sarah in her wedding dress, the grandchildren as babies. In every image, I was present, not just physically, but emotionally, the center around which the family orbited, the one who remembered everyone's favorite foods and coordinated schedules and made sure no one felt left out. That woman in the photographs looked nothing like the broken-down stranger I'd become. She was vibrant, confident, necessary. She was someone who would never have been casually discarded by the people she'd devoted her life to loving. I wanted her back. More than that, I wanted to show my children what they'd thrown away. I wanted them to understand the magnitude of their mistake, to feel the weight of their cruelty, to experience firsthand what life looked like when someone who had always been there simply wasn't. They thought they could erase me. They thought I would disappear quietly, gracefully, without consequence. They were about to learn otherwise. I had 9 months until next Easter. 9 months to plan, to prepare, to ensure that when the time came, my absence would be felt in ways they never anticipated. 9 months to become someone they couldn't dismiss, couldn't ignore, couldn't live without. 9 months to teach them the difference between solitude and abandonment. The game was no longer about getting back in their good graces. It was about making them understand what they had lost, and ensuring they never forgot it. The transformation began with my reflection. I stood naked in front of my bedroom mirror, cataloging the damage 2 years of divorce proceedings and depression had inflicted on my body. Gray roots, sagging skin, the soft middle-age spread that had crept in during months of stress eating and sleepless nights. This wasn't the woman who had raised 2 children and commanded a classroom full of teenagers for 30 years. This was a ghost, a shadow, someone who had forgotten her own power. If my children wanted to treat me like I was invisible, I needed to become impossible to ignore. I started with the basics. A call to my old hairdresser, Marcus. Ironic that he shared a name with my grandson, who squealed with delight when I walked into his salon for the first time in 18 months. "Margaret, honey, what have you been doing to yourself?" He lifted strands of my dull gray hair with the reverence of someone handling ancient parchment. "We need to stage an intervention." 3 hours later, I emerged with a sleek silver bob that took 10 years off my face, and a newfound confidence that had been buried under months of neglect. The color wasn't the brown of my youth, but a sophisticated pewter that caught the light and demanded attention. I looked distinguished rather than defeated, elegant rather than exhausted. Next came the wardrobe. I'd been living in yoga pants and oversized sweaters, the uniform of the invisibly divorced. But buried in the back of my closet were clothes from my teaching days, well-tailored blazers, silk blouses, dresses that actually fit my body instead of hiding it. I pulled them out, had them altered where necessary, and slowly began reclaiming the woman who had once walked into parent-teacher conferences knowing she could handle anything. The physical changes were just the foundation. The real work was psychological. I enrolled in a creative writing class at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had time for when I was managing everyone else's schedules. The professor, Dr. Chen, was a woman my age who had published 3 novels after 50 and treated words like weapons that could reshape reality. She saw something in my writing, a anger that had been refined into precision, a pain that had crystallized into power. "Write what you know," she told me after class one evening, reviewing a short story I'd submitted about a mother forgotten by her children. But more importantly, write what you want to change. I began keeping a journal, documenting every slight, every dismissal, every moment when my children treated me as an afterthought. But I also began documenting my plans, sketching out the elaborate production I was orchestrating for next Easter. The beauty of revenge, I discovered, wasn't in the dramatic gesture. It was in the careful preparation, the methodical gathering of resources and allies, the patient construction of consequences that would unfold naturally from choices already made. My first recruit was Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor who had inadvertently delivered the photograph that started everything. Clara had been widowed 5 years ago, and understood the casual cruelty of being marginalized by family members who found elderly relatives inconvenient. Over coffee in her kitchen, I shared my story, and watched her face tighten with familiar indignation. "That's unconscionable," she said, refilling our cups with hands that trembled slightly from age, but not uncertainty. "Family isn't supposed to be conditional. They think they can just edit me out," I said. "Like I'm a supporting character in their lives instead of the woman who gave them life." Clara nodded grimly. "My daughter-in-law does the same thing. Holiday photos where I'm conveniently in the bathroom. Family updates that somehow forget to mention I exist. They love us when they need us. Babysitting, financial help, someone to take care of their messes. But include us in their joy, their celebrations? We're not pretty enough anymore for that." We sat in comfortable silence, two women who had devoted decades to raising families that had outgrown their usefulness. But Clara had something I was just beginning to develop, a network of similarly discarded mothers, grandmothers, and wives who met weekly for book club and monthly for what they cheerfully called bitch and stitch sessions. "You should come next Wednesday," Clara said. "Meet the girls. You'd fit right in." The girls ranged in age from 52 to 78, but they all shared the particular fury of women who had been deemed expendable by the very people they had sacrificed everything to love. There was Patricia, whose son had moved across the country and called twice a year. Diana, whose daughter had power of attorney and treated her like a child. And Helen, the 78-year-old matriarch of the group, who had been systematically excluded from family gatherings after her husband's death because her presence reminded everyone of mortality. "The thing about being invisible," Helen told me during my first meeting, her voice sharp despite her age, "is that it gives you incredible freedom to observe, to learn things people don't think you're smart enough to understand." That became my strategy. Instead of fighting for inclusion, I embraced the invisibility my children had imposed on me. I began showing up where they didn't expect me, observing their lives from the shadows they'd created around my absence. I discovered that Sarah's marriage wasn't as perfect as her social media suggested. I watched from my car as she argued with her husband in their driveway after a school board meeting, their body language screaming frustration and exhaustion. I learned that David's partnership track was in jeopardy when I overheard him on the phone in a coffee shop near his office, pleading for more time to bring in clients. Most importantly, I learned that their children, my grandchildren, were asking about me. "Where's Grandma Maggie?" I heard Marcus ask Sarah during a visit to the grocery store, where I'd strategically positioned myself in the next aisle. "She used to make those cookies I liked." "Grandma's been busy," Sarah replied, her voice strained. "She's going through some things right now. Some things." As if the dissolution of a 40-year marriage and the systematic exclusion from my own family were merely some things that would pass like a cold or a bad mood. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with vague answers. "Can I call her? I want to ask her about this history project." "Maybe later, sweetheart, when she's feeling better." "When I'm feeling better." The fiction they'd constructed was remarkable in its efficiency. I wasn't being excluded. I was excluding myself. I wasn't being pushed away. I was temporarily indisposed. My absence wasn't their choice. It was my unfortunate but temporary condition. The discovery of their narrative was liberating. If I was supposedly isolating myself by choice, then I had perfect justification for actually doing so. If they were telling people I needed space, I would give them more space than they ever imagined possible. I began systematically withdrawing from every remaining connection. I stopped responding to Sarah's perfunctory text messages. I let David's calls go to voicemail and didn't return them. When Jennifer sent her monthly health inquiry, I didn't reply. I even stopped sending birthday cards to the grandchildren, though that particular decision required several glasses of wine to execute. The silence was immediate and profound. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't buzzing with obligation disguised as communication. No one needed me to babysit, house sit, or provide emergency backup for their inconveniences. The relief was intoxicating, but the real power came from what I chose to do with my newfound freedom. I began traveling. Nothing elaborate. Weekend trips to nearby cities, a week in Charleston to visit my college roommate, a long weekend in the mountains. But I documented everything, posting photos on Facebook with captions like, "Life begins at 55, and sometimes the best adventures happen alone." I made sure to tag locations and timestamp everything, creating a digital trail of a woman who was clearly not sitting at home pining for her ungrateful children. The responses were immediate and gratifying. Old friends from my teaching days reached out. College classmates emerged from social media shadows. Neighbors I barely knew began stopping me on the street to comment on my glow-up. The attention was addictive, not because I needed validation, but because it proved I could generate interest, affection, and respect from people who weren't obligated to love me. More importantly, I began cultivating relationships with people my children actually cared about impressing. Sarah's boss at the marketing firm was a woman named Catherine who attended the same book club as Helen's daughter-in-law. Through a series of carefully orchestrated introductions, I found myself having coffee with Catherine on a Tuesday afternoon, discussing modern literature and the challenges of raising teenagers in the digital age. "You know," Catherine said as we were saying goodbye, "Sarah never mentioned what an interesting mother she has. She always makes it sound like like you're not very involved in current events." "Sarah tends to underestimate people," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "It's one of her less attractive qualities." David's situation required a more subtle approach. His law firm was old school, filled with partners who valued family loyalty and traditional values. I began volunteering at the literacy center his firm sponsored, slowly building relationships with the senior partners' wives. I was careful never to mention David directly, but I made sure they knew I was Margaret Morrison, and that my son worked at their husband's firm. The effect was gradual but unmistakable. David's colleagues began mentioning seeing his mother at various events, praising my community involvement, asking why he never brought me to firm social functions. The pressure was subtle, but real. In a profession where family stability was considered a measure of character, having an accomplished mother who was mysteriously absent from his life raised quiet questions about his judgment and priorities. But my masterpiece was still months away. Easter was coming, and this time, I would be ready. Not ready to beg for inclusion, ready to demonstrate exactly what they had thrown away, and what it would cost them to get it back. I spent December and January building my case with the methodical precision of a prosecutor preparing for trial. I documented every unreturned phone call, every canceled plan, every instance where they had chosen convenience over connection. I gathered evidence of their lies, the fictional illnesses they'd invented to explain my absence, the scheduling conflicts they'd fabricated to avoid spending time with me. Most importantly, I began reaching out to the extended family they'd apparently forgotten existed. Cousins who lived across the country, old family friends who remembered when Sarah and David were children, even Robert's mother, who had maintained a cordial relationship with me despite her son's infidelity. Each conversation followed the same pattern: surprise at how long it had been since we'd talked, genuine interest in my well-being, and eventually, the uncomfortable revelation that they hadn't heard from David or Sarah in months or even years. The family network my children took for granted, the web of relationships that had always ensured their birthdays were remembered, their achievements celebrated, their children spoiled, had atrophied through neglect. They had been coasting on my emotional labor for so long they'd forgotten it was work. But I remembered everything, every Christmas card I'd sent on their behalf, every family update I'd provided, every relationship I'd maintained so they wouldn't have to. For 40 years, I had been the family's emotional infrastructure, and they had mistaken that infrastructure for scenery. Now they were about to learn the difference. By March, everything was in place. The stage was set, the players were positioned, and the date was circled on my calendar in red ink: Easter Sunday, exactly 1 year after the photograph that had opened my eyes to my family's true feelings about my place in their lives. This time, my absence wouldn't be an oversight or an unfortunate misunderstanding. It would be a choice, my choice, and unlike their cruelty, which had been casual and thoughtless, my absence would be deliberate, devastating, and impossible to ignore. They wanted to know what life looked like without me. They were about to find out. But first, they would have to earn the right to that knowledge. The final act was about to begin. The invitations arrived in late March, delivered by mail with the kind of formal script usually reserved for wedding announcements. Sarah had clearly spared no expense: thick cardstock, embossed lettering, even tissue paper inserts. The message was brief, but laden with implications. You are cordially invited to celebrate Easter Sunday with the Morrison family. Dinner at 2 p.m. Please RSVP by April 10th. No mention of last year's exclusion. No acknowledgement of the months of silence that had preceded this moment. Just a cheerful invitation as if nothing had happened. as if I were a distant acquaintance being welcomed back into their social circle, rather than the mother they had systematically erased from their lives. I studied the invitation for a long moment, noting the careful phrasing. The Morrison family, as if I weren't part of that family, as if I were being granted admission to an exclusive club that happened to share my name. The formal tone suggested this wasn't born from genuine desire for my company, but from external pressure I had carefully orchestrated over the past months. My campaign had been working. David's law firm colleagues had been asking about his absent mother. Sarah's boss had mentioned meeting me and wondered why I never appeared at family events. The extended family members I'd reconnected with had been reaching out to my children, expressing surprise at how long it had been since they'd heard from them, casually mentioning how delightful it had been to catch up with me. The children were feeling the heat, and this invitation was their attempt to manage the situation before it became professionally or socially damaging. I walked to my desk and pulled out the stationery I'd purchased for this moment, elegant cream paper with my initials embossed in gold. My response was brief and perfectly polite. Dear Sarah, thank you for the invitation. I'm afraid I have other plans for Easter Sunday. I hope you have a lovely celebration. Love, Mother. I mailed it the next day, imagining Sarah's face as she read the rejection. For months, they had operated under the assumption that I would always be available, always grateful for whatever scraps of attention they were willing to offer. The idea that I might have other plans that didn't revolve around their convenience, would be genuinely shocking. The phone calls started within hours of the invitation's delivery. First Sarah, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Mom, we need to talk about Easter. What about it? You said you have other plans. I do. What plans? I let the silence stretch, enjoying her discomfort. Does it matter? Of course it matters. We're trying to include you. Are you? Because last year you included me by not inviting me at all. This year you include me with a formal invitation delivered 3 weeks in advance, as if I'm a business associate you're obligated to acknowledge. Mom, that's not... Tell me, Sarah. What changed? What suddenly made my presence necessary after months of finding it so dispensable? Another pause. I could practically hear her calculating whether to lie or attempt the truth. She chose a middle ground that satisfied neither honesty nor deception. We miss you. Do you? Or do you miss the idea of me? The version of me that existed before you decided I was too broken to be worth your time. You're being dramatic. I'm being realistic. For the first time in months, I'm seeing our relationship clearly. You don't want a mother, Sarah. You want a prop. Someone who shows up when convenient and disappears when not. Someone who provides services, babysitting, cooking, emotional labor, without requiring genuine connection in return. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you called because you missed talking to me? Not because you needed something, not because you felt obligated, but because you genuinely wanted to hear my voice. The silence was answer enough. I'm not angry anymore, I continued, and realized it was true. The rage that had sustained me through the winter months had crystallized into something cleaner, more purposeful. I'm just done. Done pretending that proximity equals love, that obligation equals caring, that showing up is the same as being wanted. Mom, please, enjoy your Easter dinner, Sarah. I'm sure it will be lovely. Give my regards to everyone who actually wants to be there. David's call came later that evening, his approach more legalistic, as if he could negotiate a settlement to a family dispute. Mom, Sarah told me about your response to the Easter invitation. I think there's been a misunderstanding. What kind of misunderstanding? We want you there. We've always wanted you there. Have you? Because the evidence suggests otherwise. What evidence? I laughed, genuinely amused by his presumption. David, I'm not one of your clients. You don't get to demand discovery while refusing to acknowledge the case against you. I'm not refusing anything. I'm trying to understand why you're making this so difficult. I'm not making anything difficult. I'm simply declining an invitation, which is my right as a free adult. The fact that you find my refusal difficult suggests the problem isn't my behavior, it's your expectations. We're family. Family doesn't exclude each other from celebrations and then send formal invitations when it becomes socially awkward. Family doesn't ignore each other for months and then demand attendance when it's convenient. Family doesn't treat mothers like they're optional accessories to be displayed when useful and stored away when not. Nobody treated you like... David, my voice cut through his protests like a blade. Stop. Just stop. We both know what happened. We both know why it happened. The only difference is that I'm no longer pretending it's acceptable. So what do you want? An apology? I want nothing from you. Nothing at all. That's what makes this situation so impossible for you to navigate. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not demanding inclusion or attention or acknowledgement. I'm simply exercising the same right you've been exercising for months, the right to choose how I spend my time and with whom. Mom, I have to go, David. I have plans to make for Easter Sunday. The third call surprised me. It came from Jennifer, David's wife, who had always been cordial but distant, treating me with the polite respect reserved for elderly relatives who might become inconvenient. Margaret, it's Jennifer. I hope you don't mind me calling. Not at all. What can I do for you? I wanted to apologize. The words hit me like a physical blow. Of all the responses I'd anticipated, genuine remorse wasn't one of them. Apologize for what? For not speaking up last year. For not insisting that you be included. For going along with the family dynamic instead of doing what was right. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, not trusting my legs to support me. Go on. I knew it was wrong. I knew that excluding you would hurt, but I told myself it wasn't my place to intervene. David and Sarah were so convinced that you needed space, that including you would be awkward for everyone, and I took the easy path. The easy path. Yes. It was easier to go along with their reasoning than to fight for what I knew was right. It was easier to enjoy the dinner without family drama than to insist on including someone who might be sad, or difficult, or human. The word human hit harder than any accusation could have. Because that's what I had become in their minds. Inconveniently human, messily emotional, inappropriately needy in my grief and displacement. Jennifer, I've been thinking about it all year, she continued. Thinking about how I would feel if my children excluded me from family celebrations because I was going through a hard time. Thinking about how I would want someone, anyone, to stand up for me if I couldn't stand up for myself. Why are you telling me this now? Because David says you won't come to Easter dinner, and he can't understand why. But I understand. I understand that this isn't about one dinner or one invitation. This is about being treated like you, matter only when it's convenient for everyone else. I closed my eyes, feeling the careful walls I'd built around my heart crack slightly. It is about that. I know. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for my part in it. And I'm sorry that it took me so long to say so. Thank you. Will you reconsider coming to dinner? I considered the question seriously, weighing the genuine remorse in Jennifer's voice against the months of casual cruelty that had preceded it. I can't. Because you're angry? Because I'm not the same person I was a year ago. The woman who would have gratefully accepted scraps of inclusion and called it love. That woman is gone. I grieved her death along with my marriage, and I'm not interested in resurrecting her for the comfort of people who found her so easy to discard. But we could start over. Jennifer, you're a good person. But starting over implies that the slate can be wiped clean, that apologies can undo consequences. Some things can't be undone. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. So what happens now? It was a fair question, and one I'd been contemplating for months. Now I live my life. I make new friends, cultivate new relationships, build new traditions. I stop waiting for inclusion from people who find my presence burdensome. And us, your family, you'll always be my family. But family isn't just about blood. It's about choice. Every day, we choose whether to love actively or passively, whether to include or exclude, whether to show up or disappear. You've made your choices. Now I'm making mine. After Jennifer's call, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my small balcony, watching the sun set over the city I'd called home for 30 years. Tomorrow would bring more calls, more negotiations, more attempts to cajole or guilt me into compliance. Sarah would escalate to tears. David would try anger. Robert might even emerge from his new life to add his voice to the chorus demanding my cooperation. But I was done being managed. Done being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Done accepting conditional affection from people who expected unconditional devotion in return. Easter Sunday was 6 days away, and I had other plans. Real plans that didn't involve sitting at a table where my presence was tolerated rather than celebrated, using dishes that had been borrowed from me to create memories I wasn't meant to share. Instead, I would spend the day with people who had chosen my company freely, who found joy rather than obligation in my presence, who understood that love wasn't a performance but a practice. The final performance was about to begin, and for the first time in a year, I wouldn't be in the audience begging for a role. I would be center stage in my own life, starring in a story where my absence wasn't a plot point, but a declaration of independence. They had taught me to disappear. Now I would show them what true invisibility looked like. Not the awkward absence of someone who didn't belong, but the intentional withdrawal of someone who had finally learned her worth. The curtain was rising and I was ready for my close-up. Easter Sunday dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that made promises about new beginnings and fresh starts. I woke at 6 a.m. without an alarm, my body humming with an energy I hadn't felt in months. Today was the culmination of a year's worth of careful planning, the final movement in a symphony I had composed note by note. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, looking out at the cherry tree that was now in full bloom. The petals had begun to fall, creating a pink carpet on the ground that reminded me of confetti after a celebration. How fitting that my own celebration of independence should be marked by the same natural beauty Robert had planted to commemorate a marriage that was now dead and buried. My phone had been silent since yesterday afternoon, when the calls from my children had finally stopped. They had exhausted their arguments, their bribes, their threats, and their guilt tactics. Sarah had cried. David had shouted. Even Robert had emerged from his new life to add his voice to the chorus, demanding to know what was wrong with me, why I was being so stubborn, why I couldn't just show up and play nice for one afternoon. But I was no longer the woman who bent herself into uncomfortable shapes to make other people happy. I was no longer the mother who absorbed her children's disappointment and reflected it back as gratitude for whatever attention they were willing to spare. At 9 a.m., I began getting ready for my own Easter celebration. The dress I had chosen was perfect, a deep emerald silk that complemented my silver hair and made my eyes look like sea glass. I had bought it 3 weeks ago, specifically for this day, and it fit like it had been designed for my body rather than adapted to hide its flaws. I did my makeup carefully, highlighting the cheekbones that had emerged as my face had thinned over the past year, emphasizing the eyes that had learned to see clearly. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who knew her worth, not the broken divorcee who had been casually discarded by her children, but someone who had chosen her own value instead of waiting for others to assign it. At 10 a.m., Clara Henderson knocked on my door, elegant in navy blue and pearls, carrying a bottle of champagne and a radiant smile. "Ready for our adventure?" she asked. More than ready. We drove to Helen's house in Clara's immaculate sedan, arriving to find the other women from our group already assembled. They had outdone themselves. The dining room table was set with Helen's grandmother's china. Crystal glasses caught the morning light like prisms, and the centerpiece of spring flowers could have graced the cover of a magazine. But the most beautiful thing was the space I occupied at the table, not squeezed in as an afterthought, not tolerated as an obligation, but welcomed as an honored guest, whose presence completed the gathering rather than complicated it. "Margaret," Helen said, raising her champagne flute, "this is for you, for teaching us all that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is choose yourself." The toast was echoed around the table by women who understood the particular pain of being deemed disposable by people who had once claimed to love them unconditionally. We drank to second acts and new beginnings, to the discovery that life didn't end when children grew up and marriages dissolved. The meal was extraordinary, not because the food was elaborate, though Helen had outdone herself, but because every bite was seasoned with genuine affection. These women wanted to know about my writing class, my travel plans, my thoughts on the books we had discussed. They listened when I spoke, laughed at my jokes, treated my opinions as valuable rather than inconvenient. This, I realized, was what family was supposed to feel like. Meanwhile, 2 miles across town, my biological family was discovering what my absence actually meant. I knew this because at 2:47 p.m., in the middle of Helen's story about her granddaughter's college graduation, which she had been invited to attend, my phone began buzzing with text messages. "Sarah. Mom, where are you? We're worried. David. This isn't like you. Please call. Jennifer. The kids are asking for you." I silenced my phone and returned my attention to the conversation at hand, which had moved on to Patricia's upcoming cruise to Alaska. But throughout the afternoon, I could feel the phantom vibration of message after message, the digital equivalent of my children's growing panic, as they realized I had meant what I said. I didn't read the messages until I was home that evening, fortified by champagne and the memory of genuine laughter. The progression told its own story. 2:47 p.m. Sarah. Mom, where are you? We're worried. 3:15 p.m. David. Seriously, this isn't funny. Call me. 3:33 p.m. Sarah. I called your apartment. You're not answering. Where could you be? 4:01 p.m. David. I'm driving over to check on you. 4:18 p.m. Sarah. David says you're not home. Mom, please, we're scared something happened. 4:45 p.m. Jennifer. Margaret. I know you're angry, but the kids are upset. Marcus keeps asking where you are. 5:12 p.m. David. I don't understand this. We invited you. We wanted you here. Why are you punishing us? 5:33 p.m. Sarah. Everyone keeps asking where you are. What am I supposed to tell them? 6:07 p.m. David. This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. 6:24 p.m. Sarah. Aunt Linda asked about you. She seemed surprised you weren't here. This is embarrassing. And there it was. The truth finally emerging through their panic. They weren't worried about my safety or my feelings. They were embarrassed. My absence had become a problem they couldn't explain away, a question they couldn't answer without acknowledging their own cruelty. The final message had come just an hour ago. 7:43 p.m. Robert. Margaret. Whatever game you're playing needs to stop. The kids are upset, and you're making everyone uncomfortable. This isn't like you, but it was like me. This was exactly like the woman I had become. Someone who understood that her worth wasn't determined by her utility to others. Someone who refused to be treated as optional while being expected to consider everyone else essential. I poured myself a glass of wine and composed my response, sending the same message to all three of them. I had a lovely Easter celebration with friends who genuinely wanted my company. I hope your dinner was everything you hoped it would be. Please don't contact me again unless you have something meaningful to say. The response was immediate and predictable. My phone rang within minutes. Sarah, then David, then Sarah again. I let every call go to voicemail, but I listened to the messages with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a fascinating but alien culture. Sarah's voice was raw with tears. Mom, please. I don't understand what we did wrong. We invited you. We wanted you there. Why wasn't that enough? David was angry. This is emotional manipulation, and it's beneath you. If you had a problem with us, you should have addressed it directly instead of creating this drama. But it was Jennifer's message that cut deepest. Margaret, I know I said I understood, but I didn't realize how much your absence would affect the children. Marcus spent most of dinner asking where you were. He said Easter doesn't feel right without your cookies. The twins kept looking for you to help them find Easter eggs. They love you, and they miss you, and I don't know how to explain why you chose not to be here. The cookies. Of course. Every Easter for 15 years, I had made Marcus's favorite snickerdoodle cookies, shaped like little Easter eggs and decorated with pastel icing. It was one of those traditions that seemed small until it was gone, one of the invisible threads that had woven our family together. They had expected the traditions to continue without me, as if my emotional labor were a natural resource that would flow endlessly regardless of how I was treated. They had wanted the magic of Easter without acknowledging the magician who made it possible. I walked to my kitchen and opened the cabinet where I kept my baking supplies. The cookie cutters were still there, along with the food coloring and decorating tools I had accumulated over the years. I could make the cookies now, I realized. I could show up at Sarah's door with a plate of familiar comfort and watch the relief flood their faces as they welcomed me back into the fold. But that would require me to pretend that nothing had changed, to swallow my hurt and smile, while they congratulated themselves on being gracious enough to accept my peace offering. It would mean teaching them that my boundaries were negotiable, that my self-respect had a price, that my love could be taken for granted, as long as they felt bad enough about it afterward. I closed the cabinet and returned to my living room. The evening stretched ahead of me, quiet and peaceful. I had brought home a book from Helen's extensive library, a novel about a woman who rebuilds her life after her children move away. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the parallel wasn't exact. My children hadn't moved away. They had moved me away, pushed me to the margins of their lives until I finally stopped fighting for a place I had never should have had to earn. At 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with one final message. Not from my children, but from Marcus, my 15-year-old grandson. Grandma Maggie, Why didn't you come to dinner today? Did we do something wrong? I miss you. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling the careful walls around my heart crack and shift. This wasn't manipulation or guilt-tripping. This was genuine confusion from a child who remembered when his grandmother was a constant, comforting presence in his life. But even Marcus's pain couldn't undo the months of casual cruelty that had led to this moment. Even his love couldn't erase the systematic exclusion that had taught me my place in this family's hierarchy. I typed my response carefully. You did nothing wrong, sweetheart. Sometimes adults make choices that hurt each other, and sometimes those choices have consequences that last longer than anyone expects. I love you very much, and I hope you understand someday that love isn't always enough to fix everything. Then I turned off my phone and went to bed. I slept better than I had in months, dreamless and deep. When I woke on Monday morning, there were 17 missed calls and 43 text messages waiting for me. But I deleted them without reading most of them, because I had said everything I needed to say. The story wasn't over, of course. There would be more calls, more attempts at reconciliation, more efforts to guilt me back into compliance. My children would eventually realize that their mother had fundamentally changed, that the woman who had once absorbed their disappointment and reflected it back as gratitude was gone forever. They would have to decide whether they wanted a relationship with the woman I had become, someone who expected reciprocity instead of accepting scraps, someone who demanded genuine affection instead of settling for obligatory inclusion, someone who understood that love was a choice that had to be made every day, not a debt that could be called in when convenient. Some of them might rise to that challenge. Jennifer already had, with her honest apology and recognition of their collective failure. Marcus might, once he was old enough to understand that adults were just as capable of cruelty and growth as teenagers. Even David might eventually recognize that his mother deserved better than his leftover attention and grudging acknowledgement. But Sarah had revealed herself as someone who saw love as a transaction, who expected unconditional devotion while offering conditional acceptance in return. She might never understand that mothers were people too, with their own needs and limits and capacity for disappointment. And that was her loss, not mine. I had spent 55 years learning to love other people. Now I was learning to love myself, not the version of me that made everyone else comfortable, but the authentic woman who had emerged from the ashes of a failed marriage and rejected motherhood. That woman was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth choosing, every single day. The Last Supper was over. The final performance had concluded, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward to tomorrow. Not because of what others might bring to my life, but because of what I was bringing to my own. The cherry tree outside my window was nearly bare now, its petals scattered by the wind. But beneath the fallen blooms, new leaves were beginning to emerge, green and fresh and full of possibility, just like me.